All right. Hello, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay. We had some usual technical issues, but we're here now, and I'm so excited to introduce you all to my good friend, former colleague, Emily Tarani. Emily has a graduate degree in psychology from Harvard. She works for the Institute of Coaching, which is part of Harvard Medical School, and she works as a coach herself. So, welcome, Emily. And Emily actually is what I would consider a burnout expert. She knows so much more about burnout than anyone else I know. So, I'm just really excited for all of you to learn from her and really get to know her and understand what burnout is and how you can help your team, your colleagues, or even yourself manage burnout and even prevent it. So, hi, Emily. We're happy to have
Hi.
you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
All right, amazing. So, I'm going to ask Emily some questions. If you have any questions for her as well, just type them into the chat and we'll try to get to them. And of course, if you have any questions that we don't get to, I really encourage you to connect with Emily on LinkedIn and just send her like a DM. I'm pretty sure she'll respond to it knowing her. Okay, so Emily, could you define burnout for us? Like, this is something that we all see in the news. We see it on Harvard Business Review. We read about it. We know it's like this big issue, but I feel like a lot of us don't really understand exactly what burnout is.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, we use it so frequently. So there's the term where it's a term in a clinical sense where there's certain criteria to meet burnout. But I think a lot of the ways in which we use it is by the simplest definition, where it's essentially chronic stress in the workplace. And it exists on a scale and a spectrum. So you can have extreme burnout and actually classify clinically as having burnout. But you can also be on your way towards it and, have some symptoms that show that if you don't do anything to change how you're feeling and manage your stress, that you could be on the way to becoming burnt out. So Christina Maslach's definition is probably the most well known, and there's three criteria and components of burnout, which is emotional exhaustion. So as the name implied, how exhausted you feel. And then there's depersonalization, which is like negative attitudes and behavior, and really not feeling connected to the work or just exhibiting negative attitude towards what you're doing and towards others around you. And then the other is the sense of diminished personal accomplishment. So no longer feeling really committed to the work you're doing, not feeling like you have a high sense of accomplishment, and like you might not really feel like you're doing a really great job in what you're doing. So those three components really factor into what burnout is.
Yeah, and I think that's so helpful because I think for a lot of us, burnout is kind of this ambiguous thing, but it's actually been really well studied and really
Mm-hmm.
well defined, and the criteria are very clear. I know that maybe some of you listening might be able to identify some of those in individuals that you work with or individuals that are on your team, or maybe even for yourself. So you mentioned that burnout is a spectrum. Would you say that there's essentially something like a pre-burnout?
I would say, check in with how stressed you are and how frequently you're stressed out, and look at those three factors I talked about. If you're constantly feeling really fatigued emotionally, if they're doing aspects of work where you used to really be passionate about them and now you really have lost interest, or you find that you're lashing out at those around you, like these can all be signs. So look at those factors and look at really how stressed you are, because essentially that chronic stress, it's unrelieving stress. So you could be stressed for a day and then be great for a while. And that probably is indicative that you might not be burnt out. But if you're constantly feeling stressed over a long period of time, that might be a moment to check in and say, what's going on in my life? What might be shifting? Could I be on my way to running myself dry and spreading myself too thin?
Yeah. So when it comes to burnout, and maybe we see some of these signs happening, like say maybe you're a manager on a team and you see one of these three signs that you mentioned, depersonalization. Will you tell me the other two? Because I completely forgot.
Emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and diminished personal accomplishment.
Okay, great. And I mean, just personally, I feel like those really resonate with me. And even though I studied psychology as you did, I didn't actually know those were the three kind of marks of burnout.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is it's so interesting because it's a concept that's discussed so widely, but like most of us don't know that much about it.
Yeah, and they're helpful terms to know because those are the three things that you can really pay attention to get a sense of how well you're doing. And there's scales, some scales or assessments and tools that you can use to figure out if you want to do it more formally. You can always just do a check-in. People a lot of times say I'm burnt out, and they don't, they didn't use an assessment to say, okay, I'm formally at like this mark and have met the criteria. But if you wanted to do that, if you're someone who likes those type of assessments, there's plenty out there that you can use, both paid and free.
Okay. And I'm sure if anyone's interested in that, they could reach out to you and you probably
Mm-hmm.
know all of the burnout assessments.
Yeah, I can point them
Um,
in the right direction.
so if we're noticing one of these symptoms or maybe even all of them, like what do we do to fix it? Like how do we get out of it?
I would suggest to look at your resources. So a big component of burnout, and the theory of burnout is related to resources and stress. So there's a model of conservation of resources. So you get stressed out when your resources are depleted or you're perceiving them as being depleted and you're not able to, replenish them. So as a manager, it's helpful to pay attention to that for yourself. So, the oxygen mask analogy where put it on first and then you can help your team. But also notice if any of your team feel like they're very stressed out or they might not feel like they're equipped with the resources they need. And resources can be a variety of different things. They can be tangible resources, like things that they need to get their job done. It can be energy resources. Are they sleeping enough? It can be emotional. It can be social. It can be the environment. So there's a lot of different factors, but, really paying attention to what do they need or what do they feel they need. A lot of it's perception and not necessarily even connected to what's reality.
So we have a quick question from somebody that obviously has a similar memory as I do, and they would like you to mention the three symptoms of burnout again.
Sure. Emotional exhaustion. So how tired you feel, if you feel like exhausted, if you feel emotionally depleted or not. Depersonalization. So this is your negative attitudes, your behaviors towards others, towards yourself, and then diminished personal.
That would be kind of like if you're typically not a negative person, but then all of a sudden you start like just seeing everything as kind of risky and detrimental to you.
Exactly. Yeah. So like not feeling connected to your work really goes into the third one I'm about to mention. But yeah, like if you're lashing out at people, if you're not interested in things you used to be interested in, if you just generally have a bad mood, if you're irritated, if you're getting more angry, if your mood's different, maybe those aren't the emotions you're experiencing. It could be a wide range of emotions, but if you're not experiencing your normal emotions and state of being, that's definitely something to pay attention to.
And yeah, you were saying that essentially your perception of your resources and also the resources you have are very important in managing and preventing burnout.
Yeah, I mean, how we think about things is really central to everything. So if you might have resources, but tangibly, but feel like you don't, or feel like you're not being heard. So it's that perception. A manager might feel like they're giving their team the resources they need, but the team might feel like, that's great, but I actually need something in a completely different domain of our workspace, and could be burnt out from that area of it.
Yeah, definitely. So how would a manager communicate that they are indeed supportive and that they are willing to offer psychological support?
Great question. You can do this directly and indirectly. So, a lot of it is how you form trust within your team and psychological safety, where people can feel that they can communicate what they need, express their emotions, really explore and be curious and play within their environment and communicate their needs and have those needs met. You can also let your team know verbally, because again, you might feel as a manager that you're providing that psychological safety, but your team might feel differently. So letting them know that if they are feeling stressed out, if they need resources or if their needs aren't being met, that you are a person on the team that they can come talk to, that was huge. And also the follow-up. So it's one thing if you're communicating that they can come to you, but then you're not actually executing or, truly supporting and fulfilling the requests that they meet. There might be a gap there. So that, I think, ties back into the trust element of it.
Mm-hmm. How do you have any recommendations on how to build trust?
I think having compassion and empathy, not being judgmental. We're both coaches, so many managers can have a coaching mindset where you really ask questions and you approach them from a point of curiosity rather than judgment can be really helpful.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was just speaking to a client right before this, just about this exactly. And I think once we judge, like, it's very difficult to understand someone and to help them.
Yeah, exactly. And especially, if you're someone's manager, them coming to you and communicating that they don't have their needs met or they're stressed out or, they're like floundering in their role can be scary. And often they can feel like that might jeopardize their position and their job. So people might not come to you because they might not feel comfortable, and it could have nothing to do with you personally. It just they want to protect their job. So that's something that also can be helpful to recognize and figure out, okay, what's the communication style of my team? What's my communication style? And how can I let them know that they can approach me in a way that I can help them and it won't be at risk of their job, and that it doesn't communicate that they're not doing their job properly or right.
Yeah, so important. And I mean, it takes time, right?
Mm-hmm.
One kind of trick that I've noticed to help with judgment is to assume that everyone has a really good reason for what they're doing or how they're acting.
I love that.
Even though if I don't see it, like, just assume that that person has some type of great reason for how they are. And that can kind of really help move into that curiosity.
Yeah, because we really don't know what's going on in people's lives, especially in work. I mean, the people we interact with at work are probably the people we interact with most, but still. Mm-hmm. And that kind of is a silver lining from the pandemic, is that people realize how connected our personal lives are to work.
Yeah. And I mean, we're kind of just coming out of this pandemic, and I think the emotional toll was real. And now we have current events in Ukraine also putting a large emotional toll on everyone, not just Ukrainians. So, I mean, what do you think is going to be kind of the trajectory for burnout? Do you see this still like being something that's very important to watch for?
Oh, certainly. I mean, I know in a lot of industries, specifically healthcare, this is a huge thing that's not going away. And then in general, everyone is chronically stressed now, right? There's a lot of statistics about anxiety and stress that it increased during the pandemic. That was before we had all of these different war conflicts and other sources of conflict. So knowing that burnout comes from chronic stress, I think it's pretty inevitable. The good thing is that people are more aware of mental health and the term burnout and stress. So hopefully reducing the stigma around it will help people to be able to really tackle it head on and to work with their workplace and their managers and their organizations to tackle it. Also, as we were saying at the beginning, people use the term burnout. So even though technically it originated as a workplace term, you can have burnout in other domains of your life too. But essentially, you're referring to the fact that you're feeling really drained, stressed out all the time, and that you don't have enough resources. And a lot of time it is from like a mental and emotional and even physical point of view.
Yeah. I think it's like, I know we define burnout, but I think it's really important to define stress as well. Because I do think that a lot of people just use this term and like it's thrown out around so much that like I think it's never really well defined. So from my perspective, stress is essentially the perception that one does not have the resources to meet their challenges. Would you say that's accurate in this context?
Yeah, and I would build on that there's usually a threat present. So that's the difference between stress and anxiety, is usually anxiety persists even if there isn't a threat there. So, you have a stress response when you walk into the street and a car goes by and you almost get hit by it. And then as soon as you back into the sidewalk or you maintain safety at some point, then your stress response relaxes and you can kind of debrief on what just happened. And that's true for any different situation related to stress. So building on what you said, having that threat or some type of external
or perceived threat, right?
Perceived threat too, yeah.
Yeah. Which, I mean, we can all kind of consider these days. And I mean, that could also be considered in the workplace, in which kind of looming deadlines and maybe what we would consider not necessarily like threats to our survival, but they're still kind of processed by our brains as just as significant as like a car at an intersection almost hitting us type of threat.
Yeah, and if you know me well, if you're one of my clients, I talk about this all the time, that's part of what we're seeing in society is our modern technology has evolved so quickly, but our bodies adapt slower. So we're equipped to run away from a tiger, but we're not equipped to run away from an email. So when we get stressed out because our boss or manager sends us, you need to get this done, or where was this? And you feel your cortisol, which is a stress hormone, spike. You don't know what to do with it. So I always recommend exercising because that's how our bodies are programmed, to handle that stress, because usually it was something we had to run away from or freeze.
Process it through.
Yeah, exactly. So, having that understanding of how our bodies are programmed to and why we have the stress response and what it was initially supposed to do, and then how that kind of conflicts with how our modern society is set up can be helpful to understand, okay, what is the response I'm having? Why am I feeling this way? Why might I not be able to get relief from the stress, even though it's been resolved? So things like that can be helpful.
And I want to touch on something that I'm kind of picking up on here is that, like, I feel like ambiguity has like a huge kind of impact on this, in which I'm sure you say this to clients as well, but I often say, like, the brain just hates ambiguity. Like, it's something that's extremely stressful to our minds. And oftentimes we do have a lot of ambiguity in our workplaces, our work, just what is expected of us, kind of what's going to happen next. Maybe there's changes in leadership and there's a lot of uncertainty. Could you talk more about kind of the stressors that we as leaders might create in our environment by kind of increasing ambiguity more than maybe people would like to handle?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because that really is central to stress and anxiety and can greatly contribute to burnout. So as a leader, knowing that people get uncomfortable with not knowing and being uncertain about their future and their current circumstances can help you make sure that you're being transparent and honest with your team. And then that will help reduce the level of anxiety and stress that they're facing, because you're taking some element of the uncertainty out. And of course, you can't control all of that, especially when people are stressed out about some of these bigger things happening in the world. But the things that you are able to communicate and take the guessing out of can really help your team. That's how you can build trust. You can build psychological safety and some harmony with your team. So I would definitely stress communication as much as possible.
Yeah, maybe kind of diminishing any ambiguity that might exist, because I mean, just because we've sensed the ambiguity doesn't mean we need to like relay it forward to other people. We do have a question from Chris here, and I think it's a really good one. So he asks, leaders that have empathy often deeply feel the aggregate burnout of their teams. So what we're talking about here is there's individual contributors, and then those have leaders, they have managers, but then there's also managers of managers. So there's managers that are managing the individual contributors, and then there's managers that are managing those managers. And you're essentially kind of getting like a condensed version of burnout, because you're kind of getting it from so many sources.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk about how to differentiate tackling that type of burnout, where it's essentially almost been like condensed through many individuals?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge aspect here where if you're empathetic, you tend to take on other people's emotions. So you have to set those boundaries. And especially when you're, at the top of overseeing a lot of people, that's all going to cycle up to you and, really get compounded. So self-care is a huge piece of facing burnout and coping resources. I conducted research last year, and the two things that were really the most significant in being correlated with burnout and helping to have lower burnout is your personal coping strategies and characteristics, and also the social support. So I think having that in mind, knowing what strategies you can engage that are helpful for you, and a lot of that is different self-care techniques, things that really replenish you, things that relax you, things that can recharge you. Setting boundaries. So you want to be there for your team, but you can't help your team if you yourself are getting too burnt out and too stressed out. So knowing when to say no, knowing when to say yes, knowing your own limits is really helpful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I like how you mentioned with self-care, it's about kind of what is best for you, because I think oftentimes we see a lot of like self-care prescriptions in social media. But I often ask my clients, like, when was the last time you felt joy? And for a lot of people, that can be super individual. That can be playing video games or
Mhm.
doing yard work. Like, it doesn't mean like taking a bubble bath or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of times when you hear the term self-care, you feel like you're
Yeah,
obligated to do like
I
certain
cringe. Like,
things.
I cringe at that term. Like, I can't handle it.
Yeah, and that's why I usually like to phrase it like what replenishes you. So, there's certain things where you're like, oh, I'm doing something social, so this is self-care. But actually, if you're an introvert, that might actually drain you. So, what is it that you individually, with no judgment on yourself, with no influence from anyone else, like what makes you feel better and will help you get through the next day or the next minute so that you can tackle the things that stress you out.
Yeah, I often like kind of think of it as like almost like I think of it like as an like analogy of like a bucket, and like all the stress is the water, and like eventually like you're gonna like overfill the bucket, and that's like kind of when we feel like we're like losing it. And so we need to figure out ways to diminish that water level for ourselves so that we can kind of keep going. And sometimes it's difficult because a lot of times people engage in a lot of over functioning.
Mm-hmm.
And do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned the bucket analogy because I use that too. And that's
I'm
where,
sure I did not come up with it. I'm pretty sure I
yeah,
stole it from someone else.
but that's why, people always say like they handle so many big things and like their shirt getting stuck on the door handle is what tips them over and
Yeah,
freaks
yeah,
them
yeah,
out.
yeah.
And that's exactly why. But yeah, a lot of people, especially managers and people that are in the corporate world, are oriented towards their career. They feel that their stress is part of them and they really internalize it, and it motivates you, or at least you feel that it motivates you to keep going. But is that really true? And there's a lot of research that says no. And actually, when you're in a positive state of being, it helps you to explore. You can be more creative. You can be more open-minded. So, it's a huge shift to get from a place where you're really holding on to your stress and using it as a way for you to be successful, um, to another place where you feel, okay, I can handle this in a calm way and it still will get done, and it's not reflective of my self-esteem or my worth or anything like that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you're speaking to the essentially this like term over functioning is potentially a maladaptive coping strategy, because even though it feels really good to like pile more and more on, and oftentimes high achievers kind of this is just their way of being.
Right.
It feels safe. Oftentimes, as we kind of take more and more on, because we don't want to stop and feel kind of the burden of burnout, eventually it does lead to us eventually taking too much on and having to deal with that burden of burnout anyways.
Right. And that's where you're thinking of the short term versus long term. So, having so much stress and holding on to it might help you right now, but is it sustainable? Are you on a trajectory towards burnout? Can you keep doing this? If you had to do this every single day for the rest of your life, would you be okay?
Yeah, but I mean, it feels nice to live in denial and hope that it doesn't catch up with you, right? I've been there, not gonna lie. I was
Sounds like you need a coaching. We need to talk about this offline.
yeah, when we were prepping for this, Emily was asking me like, "How are you doing?" I'm like, "Well, I'm over functioning. That's what I'm doing." So yeah, good to know here is that we are not perfect in this either.
We're
And
both guilty of it. That's why we like this topic so much.
exactly. Yeah, it's like it's me search, right? That's what
Mm-hmm.
they call it in psychology when
Uh-huh.
you study something that's very relevant to you that you do as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. hmm Okay. So I think one last thing, unless anyone has more questions, what do you think about kind of the shame around burnout? So let's say that like I'm either a manager that's maybe sensing some burnout on the team, or I'm an individual that's actually feeling a bit of burnout. How do you kind of overcome this like sometimes sadness people feel at not being superhuman?
Yeah, and I think it ties into what we were just talking about over functioning. Like we all want to do so much and to accomplish a lot. And a lot of times, that's where it's diminished personal accomplishment. So a lot of times we get our self-worth and self-esteem from what we're able to accomplish in our career, especially if you're really passionate about your career, and you're trying to prove yourself to your team and to your organization and really like work your way up and hit certain goals and accomplishments. So, a big piece is that you have to be honest with yourself that you just can't handle, and that, and going back to the resources, that you might be stretched too thin, you might not have enough resources, and it could be just resources of your energy or your time. Those are both resources that can contribute to burnout. So just not having enough time in the day to get through everything that's on your plate. So I would encourage people to, take a look inwards and try and figure out how is your self-worth and how you look at yourself linked to your job tasks and your responsibilities and your roles and your values, and where can you find more balance, to be more patient and compassionate. How would you talk to yourself if yourself was a third person? Because we often tend to be the most mean and talk the least nicely to ourselves, and we would never talk to our coworker or someone who works underneath us or above us in our organization.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to like think like if this if I was a loved one of mine, would I want them to partake in this type of cycle? Would I want them to be doing the behaviors that I'm doing? And the answer is usually not. Like oftentimes, like you're saying, we're most hard on ourselves.
Exactly. And with a lot of my clients, I talk about your future self versus your current self. So, you know, right now you could continue to do all these things that you need to do and feel the stress and take it on. But at some point, will future you be burnt out or upset or have any negative consequences? And what can you do now to ensure that your future you is set up for success in all different areas?
Mm. And like as you're speaking, I'm thinking that this could also apply to teams. So like present team versus future team. And
Mm-hmm.
could this team sustain this type of effort in the future? Is there going to be like essentially a burnout phase if the team keeps running at this pace?
Yeah, exactly. And recognizing that as an individual and as a group, the stigma around it. So knowing and recognizing and talking about the fact that, like, if you raise your hand that I'm really stressed out and I'm on my way to burnout, doesn't mean that you're slacking. It doesn't mean that you're not care. If anything, it means the opposite, that you're doing too much and you're caring too much. Because if you don't care, you're not going to put so much effort and put so many resources into something. So you're not going to get to that state. So it's this balance of caring, but not overexerting yourself or the team's resources.
Yeah, and that makes me think while you were speaking, I think there's research from Stanford that indicates that almost all burnout factors are environmental except like one. Is that, yeah? Maybe I
Uh,
can make that
that I
sound.
have to look up on. I mean, in the research that I did, the environment definitely was a factor. That was something that I actually need to do more research on. Again, your personal coping strategies really was important. So that's basically like how you, as a person, individually handle stress. Then next is actually social support from your supervisor, which indicated that, it was actually more important than even a spouse's support of you. And that's
Interesting.
because the supervisor can actually make a difference in the burnout. So, where a spouse can give you emotional and social support and say, oh, I'm so sorry, like, you had a bad day, I'm here for you. if you are stressed because your schedule is really terrible and you're not getting enough sleep, my study was on nurses. So if someone's working the night shift and getting burnt out from that, they can go to their supervisor and their supervisor can change their schedule. So that support from their supervisor is actually a bit more effective. And then the third aspect I studied was an environmental component, but it's a little hard to parse that apart because I was looking at counseling resources. So where there were counseling resources offered, the employees tended to have less burnout. But is that because an organization that has counseling resources is in tune with like mental health and being conscious of factors that contribute to burnout, or is it the actual counseling itself? So it definitely is important. Environmental factors are
Yeah, but it sounds to me like there's a lot of external factors outside just the individual. So if someone is experiencing burnout, it often is very much based on kind of the things in their external environment.
Certainly, like work demands, personal stressors in their personal life, not having work-life balance, definitely.
I find it really uplifting to hear that like a manager or your leader can have such a great influence on burnout in that social support factor. I think that's really optimistic because sometimes I think managers do wonder, like, do I really have an influence here?
Yeah, and I mean, going back to the definition, it's workplace stress. That's chronic. So as a manager, you have control over what that workplace environment looks like and what the stressors are for your team and the people that work for you. So you have a very influential role in how people are doing, both in their responsibilities and accomplishments and from a mental and emotional standpoint.
And I know you mentioned when we kind of met to discuss this topic before this live was that even in situations in which a manager doesn't have they have very little impact on any structural change, that they can still help with burnout rates by showcasing that social support that you were speaking of.
Yeah, exactly. So the two main forms are the tangible support or practical support, and then the social and emotional. So just being there, being, available for people to talk to you can really be helpful. And also on the flip side, if you do want to approach your manager about it and have the stigma, there's some key tips to realize that can help facilitate the conversation. And first is recognizing that your manager isn't your therapist, and to be very clear and have a set goal in mind for the conversation. So if you need if you know what you need to help your burnout, be clear about that. Try and stick to the facts as much. Try not to. It's an emotional thing, and of course, share your emotions, but try to stick to the facts, stick to what you need, and really share and tie it into the purpose of your job role and how you can continue to help the company. So you both want to be honest, but also, understand where your manager will be coming from and how you can communicate properly. So I just wanted to throw that in there too, because a lot of times people are like, this is all fine and good, but how can I actually talk to my manager? Because sometimes managers aren't necessarily the most approachable people all of the time either.
There's definitely a spectrum, just like any career. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, but I mean, we're already 7 minutes over, which I mean is to be expected when you and I are speaking. But I do want to be mindful of your time, and I want to thank everyone that came to listen to this discussion. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them here, and we'll try to get them answered. And just connect with us if you want to get one of those resources mentioned here. And I just want to thank you, Emily, for coming on. Like, I really enjoyed this, and it's so much superior to have you on than just doing this by myself.
I loved it. It was so much fun. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Hopefully we'll have you back sometime, some other day.
Definitely.
All right. Take care, all.
Thanks.